Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air. Our program is presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. It's the 38th week of 2014. Aware was established after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East. Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and control of them gives the U.S. an advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. To that end, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan and Iraq a dozen years ago. This week, President Obama announced that he's attacking Iraq and Syria. That's hardly surprising. The president who promised hope and change has become the fourth president in a row to bomb Iraq. Like the others, he says he's doing it to fight terrorism. In this case, the ISIS group, which was funded and supported by principal U.S. allies in the region, from Saudi Arabia to Turkey. Obama says he's killing more people in the Mideast in the last day or so by an airstrike southwest of Baghdad because ISIS threatens Americans and what he called American interests. That's partly true because the principal American interest is the control of Mideast energy resources. Obama's new killing is called fighting terrorism because terrorism is the name the U.S. gives to the armed resistance, which of course can be vicious and brutal, to the generations-long U.S. invasion of the region. Even the greatest example of terrorism, the crimes of 9/11-2001, were counterattacks. Al-Qaeda said they were launched for three reasons. One, Israel's oppression of the Palestinians. Two, the Clinton administration's sanctions on Iraq, which killed 500,000 children, and Clinton's Secretary of State said it was worth it. And three, Saudi Arabia's allowing U.S. troops into the Muslim Holy Land. The Obama administration is now trying to rally the Sunni alliance, principally Saudi Arabia and Israel, against ISIS, hoping to continue to use it against the Shia alliance, Iran and Syria, with Russia and China in the background. But the U.S. has no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests, as has been said. And those interests are the interests of the American 1% in controlling the Eurasian economy by means of controlling Mideast energy resources, the world's greatest material prize, as the State Department put it at the end of World War II. Shortly after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Zbigniew Brzezinski, an advisor to Democratic presidents from Carter to Obama, pointed out that America's control over the Middle East gives it indirect but politically critical leverage on the European and Asian economies that are also dependent on energy exports from the region. If the United States can maintain its control over Iraq, with the world's second largest known oil reserves and right at the heart of the world's major energy supplies, that will enhance significantly its strategic power and influence over its major rivals in the tripolar world that has been taking shape over the last 30 years, one pole being U.S.-dominated North America, a second being Europe, and a third being Northeast Asia, that is China and Japan, linked to South and Southeast Asian economies. It is a rational calculation on the assumption that human survival is not particularly significant in comparison with short-term power and wealth. And that is nothing new. These themes resonate through history. The difference today, in this age of nuclear weapons, is only that the stakes are enormously higher. As a writer at counterpunch.org puts it this week, if the U.S. were not controlled by the 1% wedded to the military-industrial establishment, and if common sense were the operative principle, it would make sense to refrain from any military action, leaving it to the Iraqi and Syrian people to deal with these new oppressors, perhaps with local powers' support. The record shows that U.S. military actions in the Middle East produce no good, but rather lots of harm. It's not in the interest of the vast majority of Americans to kill people around the world for the profits of the 1%. But that's what the American government is doing, up to and including President Obama's administration. In 1967, the civil rights leader Martin Luther King admitted with dismay that, quote, "the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government." Tragically, nothing has changed in the intervening years. American presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years, mostly civilians. Not to spread peace and democracy, as they claimed, but to ensure U.S. economic control, as the rest of the world recognizes. They have made the U.S. government the most feared and hated in the world. Noam Chomsky wrote in one of the first and most read books on the 9/11 attacks, "Everybody's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, there's a really easy way. Stop participating in it." In much of the world, the U.S. is regarded as the leading terrorist state, and with good reason. The U.S. has 1,000 military bases outside its borders. Russia and China have none. The U.S. Special Operations Command, a 63,000-member private army that reports to the U.S. President's National Security Council, not to Congress, is active by its own admission in 124 countries around the world. Its activities include rendition, that is kidnapping, enhanced interrogation, torture, and disposition, murder. Read about the CIA's disposition matrix. Last year, President Obama told White House aides, "Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine," close quote. In his Terror Tuesday sessions, as the administration explained to the New York Times, Obama has selected from baseball cards presented to him by CIA Director John Brennan thousands of people to be killed. Obama's drone strikes alone have resulted in 5,000 deaths, including 200 child corpses. He still continues to order drone strikes, including strikes in Africa. In recent weeks, Obama, working for the American 1%, has backed Israel and Ukraine as those governments killed thousands of civilians and their children in Donbass and Gaza. You're watching Aware on the Air. Aware wants to stop the child killers in the White House and the Congress in their efforts around the world on behalf of the American 1%. We try to do that by exposing the real story of what's going on over against the false account that the U.S. media, a creation of big business, wants you to believe. We'll challenge that fake account tonight with commentaries by Ron Zoke, David Green, and perhaps one or two other people. And we'll begin with Ron Zoke on the harsh realities of power.
The title alludes to a recent piece by Robert Kagan, perhaps the chief neocon ideologue recently, and apparently he has written some rather influential books, including those that have been noticed and commented on favorably by none other than Barack Obama. The piece in the Wall Street Journal titled "America's Dangerous Aversion to Conflict." So it's the aversion to conflict and not the enthusiasm for it that is dangerous, according to Mr. Kagan. The U.S. increasingly yearns to escape the harsh realities of power, but as recent events make clear, raw force remains a key element in international politics. Kagan is the author of The World America Made, and interestingly also the husband of Victoria Nuland, one of the agitators in Ukraine, in Kiev, but that's another story. Kagan really pulls out the stops here and appeals to well, the standard neocon appeals to fear and greed and hatred. He points out that we are, Americans, have difficulty understanding the tragic realities of life, the tragic dimensions. This is because we are raised in the tradition of the Enlightenment and the belief that people are or can be rational. And these people in the Middle East who are opposing us have no such tradition. They just have a lot of resentments going back centuries. And in effect, they are irrational, so it's impossible to negotiate with them. or to expect them to act rationally. So once again, he revives the notion that the only way we can deal with them, the only thing that they can respect is power, violent power and domination. They are these who oppose us in ISIS are motivated by desires that transcend mere materialism and rationality. We have, as a consequence of our enormous power, the sole superpower left in the world, the responsibility now, which we seem to have trouble understanding or acquiescing in, that this enormous power brings with it responsibilities to the rest of the world. Americans believe their disillusionment with the use of force over the past 12 or 13 years somehow means that force is no longer a factor in international affairs. Well, that seems flatly false, but anyway, I would urge you to read this and to look at some of his Kagan's other books: A Twilight Struggle, American Power in Nicaragua; Of Paradise and Power, America and Europe in the New World Order; Dangerous Nation, America's Place in the World from its earliest days to the dawn of the 20th century, and so on. So we must be ready to fight, bomb, shoot, burn, kill, because that's the only thing that they understand, according to Mr. Kagan. Then Robert George appears in the local daily. Robert P. George, the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University.
That sounds like big trouble.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Every one of those words is dangerous.
So the ISIS fighters are motivated by apparently the same struggle. He says, he mentions Islam's hijacking by people driven by the same diabolical impulse that unleashed the likes of Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot on the world. We must rip away the religious mask and reveal its idolatrous soul before the world. So again, they are the devil incarnate. In this newest front in the twilight struggle against totalitarianism, and he's dusting off that one, humanity itself hangs in the balance. So not only are we fighting to defend civilization, but humanity itself. Humanity itself hangs in the balance as it did in the heyday of Nazism and communism. At stake is nothing less than the future of freedom and dignity. For America, 9/11 was a call to engage in the fight. Let us keep answering the call for our own sake and for that of posterity. So we must fight to save humanity, according to Professor George. The third voice calling for war is Henry Kissinger, who's back with a new book on world order. Henry Kissinger, according to this quotation in U.S. News, says the United States needs to strike the terror group in retaliation for the decapitation of 2 American journalists, then eliminate it as an operating force in the region. So we're going to destroy it. We have to keep in mind, he said, that we've been in 5 wars since World War II, and only one can we say we've reached the objective. So we should state that the objective does not get us into an endless conflict. And indeed, there are several people, a number of people opposed to the current escalation and the war, who's asking us to, or the USA to say, what is the objective here? What is the actual mission? How will we know when it's ended? is there some termination strategy for this? And again, this just draws a blank. There's no answer to that. Interesting piece by one Michael Tomasky in the Daily Beast a few days ago. He says, please, let's not destroy ISIS. Obama's mission is hard enough without him stating a clearly unachievable goal. Why do presidents feel they have to sound like John Wayne? Americans should support the mission against ISIS, and he thinks there should be one, apparently conducted by diplomacy and subversion and so on. One may well choose to do so warily because, as I wrote in the wake of President Obama's speech last week, it depends on a lot of uncontrollable variables, such as the Saudis behaving like good guys, against which the odds are rather long. But a deeply fundamentalist nation state in the Levant that is large and extremely wealthy would be an obvious disaster for the region, and the United States has a number of reasons to oppose it. So we have to try to stop them. But what we're not going to do, he says, and I wish Obama and especially John Kerry would stop saying it, we're not going to destroy ISIS. Marginally softening this with ultimately, the Islamic State will not be crushed, as John Kerry huffily put it in a recent tweet. This is not possible. We all know this. We've been trying to destroy Al-Qaeda for 13 years now. We have not, we will not, and we will not destroy ISIS. We can't destroy those outfits. They're too nimble and slippery and amorphous, and everybody knows it. So why say it? Why not say that what we hopefully can do and what we should do, contain it? So I'm not sure what he means by containing it. Again, it's one of those slogans that are difficult to translate into an actual policy or strategy. But there it is. As far as it goes, it's sounds right to me. But if we can't really call off this momentum building for more airstrikes, and eventually, some are saying now, inevitably, boots on the ground in Iraq and the coming of Iraq 3.0. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air. Our format tonight is to go around and make some comments at the start and then go around a second time with some responses to those comments. I've got a number of things I'd like to ask Ron about, but we'll go on to David Green with some comments about some local enormities, I think, primarily, right, David?
Yeah, I'm just going to read a letter that I've submitted to the News Gazette regarding the issue of Stephen Saleta and his unhiring from the University of Illinois. It conforms to the 250-word limit that we're allowed on a monthly basis. Our allotment, our ration of words, as the News Gazette prescribes. So therefore, it's not very long. But it summarizes, I think, a lot of things that I'd like to say about this. The persecution of Stephen Saleta has long been in the making at a university that has strong ties to the Israel lobby, local Jewish institutions, and corporate technology military interests, and has excluded pro-Palestinian perspectives from its administrative apparatus. Saleta's appointment was an opportunity for the lobby and Zionist donors who post-Gaza atrocities are concerned about losing control of the narrative to assert their influence in no uncertain terms. But actions that followed the transparently unethical administrative shenanigans took on a life of their own in our local community. While Saleta's supporters asked Phyllis Wise to reconsider her decision and pass Saleta's appointment to the trustees, hair-trigger local elites interpreted this campaign as a personal attack upon her and her credibility as chancellor. Wise has provided stellar support to the corporate neoliberal university projects of the local 1% and country club crowd. They circled the wagons with as much alacrity as supporters of the mascot ever did, with baseless personal attacks on Saleda and lame appeals to civility, quote unquote, that mask no inconsiderable anti-Palestinian animus. The nearly universal whiteness of the signatories of full-page ads in the local newspaper is not unrelated to both the class interests and implicit bigotry of this well-heeled lynch mob. Meanwhile, only a small handful of local Jews, the most rabid Zionists among us, have signed this ridiculous statement. Most Jews have their doubts, or worse. Local Jewish communal leaders are not only silent, but I fear unwilling or unable to provide the desperately needed ethical guidance in response to this travesty. That's the end of the letter that I wrote. And I would only add to that in the context of these events and the reaction to it, of the protests, of the perhaps upcoming protests that bring in all kinds of other issues, labor issues on this campus, larger issues of academic freedom, of adjunct faculty members, and larger issues even then of the relationships of the university to the military-industrial complex, which is more at the heart of what this program is about. I think some people would look at the people, both the supporters of Stephen Saleda and his opponents, would look at it and ask, what are the larger issues involved here? From the supporters' point of view, I would look at it and say, I hope that this conflict will end up being about more than whether one person is hired or fired. Although, of course, the goal is to have him hired. But the point is that the threat that his hiring presented to our various political and economic establishments at various levels, that threat is really what that was about. And there is no problem, and there is in fact a compelling interest for those of us who favor his hiring of seeing this as a part of larger issues that should be addressed in the context of supporting his hiring. We will be accused, those of us who support Stephen Saleda and want to place this in a proper context and proper framework, we will be accused of bringing in these larger issues. We will be accused of bringing in outside agitators, as the law professor and the professor of gender studies who's showing up on Thursday, this coming Thursday, to speak at the Independent Media Center. We will be accused of having an agenda by those who indeed see Stephen Saleda's appointment not just in trivial terms of what he may have said on his tweets, but as a larger threat. We will be accused of that, and we should gladly accept that accusation and affirm that accusation that indeed we do have an agenda, that we welcome outside agitators and agitation of all kinds in relationship to the broader issues that this one incident is symptomatic of, and hopefully will be a spark towards enlightening many other issues to which it relates on a local, national, and global scale.
Thank you, David. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're changing our format a bit. Our format depends upon what members and friends of Aware participate. And tonight, I think what we're going to do is stick to a somewhat stricter format. We're going to go to responses to the things that have been said so far, and we'll do responses in a reverse order. So we'll start with David Green, if he wants to say anything about what Ron
respond
or
to
I
myself.
Yeah, you can respond. You can respond to yourself if you want, but there are other people here too.
I didn't agree with what I just said. So
Oh, okay. All right. Well, good. Yeah.
No, I
That's
do
what
want
makes
to,
horse racing, right?
I do want to respond to Ron, and they're the very issues that we're talking about. I mean, they're the very issues that are implied and should be implied and should be elaborated and fleshed out as we go from hiring issues from the neoliberal campus to neoliberal issues in general, and issues of global domination through violence. These are all related to each other. So what Ron has raised is a very important issue in understanding the nature of discourse on foreign policy. We are taught from a young age that there is this tension in how big thinkers, the kind of people that work at the Carnegie Endowment and the Heritage Foundation at the James Madison Center of Peace, this or that, we are taught that there has been this tension, especially in the world post-World War II, but even before then, against idealism and realism in foreign policy. We are taught that these are the two poles of thinking in foreign policy. And of course, these poles are the same pole, and they limit our ability and our propensity to want to think more broadly upon what our foreign policy is really about. These two poles of idealism and realism, Ron mentioned the idea of that the world is a tragic place, and if you want to do good, you're going to do some evil while doing good. Well, this directly reflects the influence of the liberal philosopher Reinhold Niebuhr after World War II. And then there's the realist position, which at that time was most effectively represented and articulated by George Kennan, who didn't have much of a view of human nature and understood very well, as he stated as his language in one of the famous national security documents of that period, the fact that we are only 5%, that America only constitute 5% of humans, but we want to control 50% of wealth, is bound to stir resentment in the rest of the world, and we will have to, on occasion, use violent and other coercive measures in order to retain our control over that wealth. That is just as true now then, even though we only control 20 or 25%. We are still 5% or less than 5% of humanity, but we still control 20 or 25% of that wealth, have our tentacles into much more of that wealth than that, and want to maintain control of that in the Middle East and elsewhere. So the problem has always been with Robert Kagan or several other people named Kagan, or the people who call themselves neoconservative, meaning they're relatively idealistic about these things. What idealism means in this context, of which Kagan has articulated, every so often, if you're an idealist and you understand that you have to use violence, you have to redefine the idea that there's bad people in the world. And even though we want to control the world's wealth, that doesn't make us bad. What makes people bad is that they want to resist our control of that. So these terms, these definitions, this language has to be repeated and reworked and put into different contexts. We move from the Cold War to the War on Terror to the War on ISIS. It always does get back to John Wayne. It always does get back to there's good guys and bad guys, and we're the John Wayne. We're John Wayne played Davy Crockett at the Alamo. We're Davy Crockett. So that's what it gets back to, and that's what we have to resist. Those are the limits of the debate that we have to move beyond in the anti-war movement in relationship to ISIS and to just about everything else.
Thank you, David. You're watching Aware on the Air, sponsored by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. And we'll go to Ron Zook for responses to what he's heard this evening.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask David if he's heard of a group called the AMCHA Initiative.
I have heard of them, but their link is broken.
Yeah, well,
Overuse, perhaps.
Yeah, no,
well, it's a Zionist organization that apparently is compiling a list of professors of Middle Eastern studies, Middle Eastern history, and so on, who are being accused of anti-Israel bias because they have not been sufficiently favorable toward Israel's military operations in the Middle East, for one thing. And they advertise themselves as protecting Jewish students from bad professors who may upset them and say things that they will dislike and disagree with and cause bad feelings. So there is apparently now a blacklist of some 200 names that is in circulation. I don't know whether Professor Salita was on it, but he hadn't quite made the list yet. But there is this list of some 200 names, and students are being encouraged not to sign up for any courses offered by those professors and to avoid them. And
boycott, isn't that a
exactly.
dirty word?
Yes, right.
yes, and so that's how we will punish these people for not being sufficiently pro-Israel.
I'm happy to say that one of the professors at the University of Illinois who's on the list is Professor Linda Herrera, a friend of this ground, a visitor to this program a couple of months ago, and we'll have her back on shortly, and we'll ask her what she thinks of her blacklisting by AMCHA. She is an expert on Egypt and the count of what has happened in Egypt, what the U.S. has done vis-a-vis Egypt, and Egypt's role in the destruction of Gaza is very much part of our remit. So we'll have Professor Herrera back here soon.
So the next step then would be to find out whether our chancellor has had any contact with this group and with their discourse and publications.
There are several groups like that, and there have
Yeah.
been for quite some time. Daniel Pipes has his Campus Watch group. There's an organization called the American Israel Cooperative Exchange, AICE, which is sponsored by something called the Schusterman Family Foundation. And, you know, as much as they talk about Jewish students allegedly and wrongly being in a hostile environment on campuses, they really can't find a whole lot of evidence to support that. So they either have to make stuff up or they have to acknowledge the fact that what they're doing is actually working. But what this AICE does, just to show you how silly all of this is, the AICE has a program in which they fund Israel fellows to teach on campuses at in this country to promote Israel's views. And one of the people who was hired to teach in this fellowship program was a woman who came to this campus around 2010 and who has been here ever since. Even though these are 2-year programs, she's been here ever since. I think this is the 5th year that she's been here. Her name is Rona Seidelman, and she's a kind of a liberal Zionist, and she teaches a course in which she talks about debating the history of Israel and Palestine. I'm sure it's from a fairly tepid point of view. And she hasn't, of course, gotten any criticism from the Jewish community about her teaching. But she has been hired to teach that course. She's paid by an outside entity, which can fairly be called the Israel Lobby. And that's exactly how much of a threat that anti-Zionist professors have been on campuses in this country. So there is really nothing there. And all of the panic, what Ron, you refer to, goes back to was really ramped up after the second Intifada in 2000, and really hit a peak around 2004, 2005, which I followed very closely and documented very, very closely on this campus and on other campuses, and has since sort of gone on a downward slope because for a couple of reasons, I think. Because the pro-Palestinian view, or the view critical of Israel, has become increasingly credible on this campus, and it's become increasingly clear to more people that these views need to be heard, that they can't be associated with anti-Semitism, and so forth. And I think that the Israel lobby has actually, in terms of what you're saying, even with this recent upsurge of Amshah and the case of Stephen Saleta and so forth, I think there's been a general downward curve of their ability to arouse the troops in an environment in which after Lebanon in 2006 and Gaza in 2008 and Gaza in 2012 and Gaza in 2014, it becomes so clear to so many people that there's something quite wrong here and that you can't get away with making simplistic comments.
Some have said that they're losing control of the narrative.
Exactly.
For a long time, for decades, they dominated it, and that seems to be slipping.
Yeah, and even the AICE, the group that I just referred to, there's you can go on their website and find all kinds of lurid writings by a guy named Mitchell Bard, and they amount to basically nothing. I mean, they basically amount to them saying, there's this terrible anti-Semitism on campus, but we've got it under control, so don't worry. I mean, it's really nothing, because the examples they try to cite, as you might expect, are just anecdotal and meaningless. Just like when you hear about upsurges of anti-Semitism in Europe, and you really start looking at it, you start looking at anything that trying to look behind anything that Abraham Foxman and the ADL has to say, you'll find that there's basically nothing there. And what you find, if you find anything there, you find people opposed to Israel killing innocent people.
Did you see this rally in Berlin the other day where Chancellor Merkel gave a good speech against the emergence of anti-Semitism in Europe recently? Splendid rally, people standing up against anti-Semitism, so forth. The rally was joined by a group of people who were anti-Zionist. And condemned Islamophobia, said anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are the same sort of thing. We need to condemn that, and we need to condemn the establishment of a racist state which participates in the racism involved in anti-Semitism and in Islamophobia. And the poor Berlin police apparently didn't know what to do with the anti-Zionists who showed up to participate positively in the anti-Semitism rally, and they had a difficult time sorting it out, but it raised some of the ambiguities of the question in a particularly sharp way. Other comments, Ron? Other responses?
No.
You're listening to Aware on the Air. Ron began tonight with a reference to Robert Kagan, a leading neocon thinker, if that's correct. And his article on America's dangerous aversion to conflict. I think that's really quite important. The idea here is the old clash of civilizations idea that goes back to Samuel Mad Dog Huntington, professor of the science of government at Harvard, and the idea that the problem we have in the Middle East is that we're rational and they aren't, they being essentially all those people in the Middle East, see references to Islamophobia above. But the real problem that Kagan is dealing with is the problem that used to be called the Vietnam Syndrome.
Yeah.
The Vietnam Syndrome was the view amongst Americans that something had gone badly wrong in Vietnam. Already by the late 1960s, 70% of Americans opposed America's war on Vietnam, not just that it was a mistake, but that it was a crime, that we were doing something quite wrong in Vietnam. And that's the problem that American presidents, particularly American political leaders, have had to deal with for more than 40 years. The 40 years of neoliberalism in America is paralleled by 40 years of neoconservatism, an attempt to try to overcome the Vietnam syndrome. The success, such as it was, of the first Gulf War under George Bush I, led President Bush to say that has finished the Vietnam syndrome. That is, what he meant was that the opposition to the U.S. using its military force in imperialist fashions around the world would no longer be opposed by Americans. Well, of course it is, and that opposition has grown throughout the war, the Bush and Obama wars of the last decade. So what Kagan is trying to do is rescue this notion of American the appropriateness of America killing people around the world in pursuit of its goals. These goals are announced as the goals of the Enlightenment. In fact, of course, the goals of the financial goals of the economic goals of the American 1%. He wants to overcome the disillusion with the use of force, that is, overcome the Vietnam syndrome, redivivis as what we might call the Iraq syndrome. And in doing so, of course, he's supporting the chief magistrate and his attempt to get his war on in Iraq and Syria these days.
Well, there's a much more grandiose statement of it here. Kagan writes, "Now, in the wake of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it is the U.S. that seems to be yearning for an escape from the burdens of power and a reprieve from the tragic realities of human existence." So he's reminding us of the tragic realities of human existence, which require us to fight, bomb, shoot, burn, kill.
These big, grand thinkers like Kagan and Thomas Friedman and David Brooks have really, when you look at them, so little to say that they have to speak in these universal terms, these grand historical terms, to reassure themselves that they're at the helm of what's going on. I thought it was telling to read that Obama met with some journalists the other day about ISIS.
Twice.
To consult with them, among them Thomas Friedman and David Brooks, and among them, it was interesting, the publications that were represented at this meeting. It was the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Atlantic. And so there you have the kind of acceptable liberalism of the New York Times and New Yorker, and then the moderate conservatism, not the Tea Party Atlantic, but the literate, urbane kind of people who write in that journal. So that's what you have to reassure people, is that when we're going to war and when we're defining people, us as being good and other people as being wicked, that we're doing so in the highest literary and moral fashion.
And Ron's second example of this, Robert George, a Princeton professor, God help him, and his invocation of totalitarianism as the enemy, the constant enemy that we're battling against, the general forces of darkness that turn up all the time, Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot. This, once again, it's traditional. It's the reason, by the way, Reinhold Niebuhr's name is trotted out. No one really pays any attention to Reinhold Niebuhr anymore, but he did have a grandiose scheme to talk about these things and how we had, unfortunately, to deal with the forces of darkness by doing some kind of nasty things. But it was okay.
Yeah, well, we're evil and sinful, but the other side are even more so.
They're worse.
So we're justified in killing them.
And that conveniently gets away those things that we might be embarrassed about, like killing children and whatnot, because, of course, they're just regrettably necessary in a fallen world, yada, yada, yada. Gotta
face the tragedy of human existence. We need to acquire the tragic sense of life that we read about in Unamuno, and just these terrible conflicts which are irreconcilable, and that's the tragedy of life.
I thought there was, strangely, I was surprised to find what may actually be a germ of truth, a nugget of truth in the things you were summarizing.
That
from Robert
happens
George.
sometimes.
It happens sometimes. We used to say on another program we do around here that no one can be wrong all the time. We have all these examples of people who seem to violate that rule. But in any case, I think that may be true for Mr. George as well in his reference to Pol Pot and his comparison with the to Cambodia, to the Islamic Caliphate right now. If one wanted to give an account of what happened in Cambodia, and we have had occasion to mention it here on the program, you might mention the fact that the United States dropped more bombs on Cambodia, a peasant society in Southwest Asia, than it had dropped on Japan in the course of the Second World War. We get bombed Cambodia more heavily than it. Anything that flies on anything that moves, said Henry Kissinger of unhappy memory, telling the Americans to, in the secret war in Cambodia, the secret bombing of Cambodia, simply to kill everybody. Anything that flies on anything that moves. Well, they did a pretty good job of it, but it suggested that the horrors of the successor regime in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge with Pol Pot at the head of it, those horrors were in some sense bound up with the horrors the society had undergone in this intensive bombing campaign, the complete destruction of the society and killing a large percentage of the people in the society. We tend to forget that when we talk about the horrors of the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia. Well, the parallel has been drawn, as a matter of fact, to the Islamic State group, the ISIS or the Caliphate, if you like, in that we forget, but they don't, that the United States just killed 1 million people in Iraq, and that the people who are prosecuting this vicious regime called ISIS in Iraq and Syria are doing something similar to what Pol Pot did after the destruction of Cambodia. There is perhaps a parallel here. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, as Mark Twain said, and there's a particularly dark rhyme perhaps at work here in terms of what we've produced in Iraq and Syria in parallel to what we produced in Cambodia. Other points that you made, Ron, that this notion that the U.S. is trying to contain ISIS for the good of the world, of course, ignores not only what the United States has done in the region in the last 10 years, but also the motives for what the U.S. has done in the last 10 years, why the U.S. is there. Look, if the principal product of Iraq were asparagus, we would not have spent 10 years killing 1 million people there. We have other fish to fry, so to speak.
You're mixing your metaphors.
Yeah.
And I really, I don't like asparagus.
I didn't endorse that the containment thesis. That was quoting Mr. Michael Tomasky, and he has a kind of halfway position. And if again, if that's all we're going to get, then I would say, okay, let's do that. Let's contain them for a while until we can get this mess straightened out.
But there's a sense in which, once again, that the propaganda line of the United States learns nothing and forgets nothing. Containment, of course, was George Kennan's classic word for how the U.S. should deal with the Soviet Union after the Second World War. Yeah. And of course, that was primarily part of a propaganda campaign to convince the American people to maintain the military-industrial complex and the American economic control of Eurasia that the U.S. Inherited from the Second World War. In order to do that, we had to construct an enemy. We had to say that the communists were about to take Connecticut, and they had to be stopped in Germany by tanks and planes and so forth. Otherwise, they would descend upon us and, kill your grandmother. This was all nonsense, as people began to realize after the fall of the Soviet Union, but it worked at the time. It worked for 2 generations to support an American imperialist control of a good bit of the world. And so, you know, it's, the rhetoric has not run its course. It's still pretty active, and to brush it off and refurbish it and now try to apply it to a new horrible totalitarian enemy is exactly what we would expect of our chief thinkers, I'm afraid. There was one point also that you made, David, that I wanted to mention in passing. Yeah, I think it's vital, as you have insisted before, that the local dispute, the argument surrounding Professor Salaita and the behavior of the University of Illinois in regard to his employment, that this be put in context. And we understand this not only as part of the attempt by the local 1% and the Israel lobby to make sure its writ runs in the councils of the university, but also the tradition of intellectual control on sensitive political issues in the university never went away. This has been the case for a good long time, the years that we've been talking about, and even many years before that as well. So to understand what the University of Illinois is doing here, it's worthwhile to look at the antecedents, to look at the traditions of what opinions are allowed within the narrow constraints of academic freedom as it's understood in the American university. Only those who bought the propaganda, once again, who brought the account of what the university was and should be, only they will be surprised by what has happened to Professor Salaita. It is very much in the tradition of the American university. And David, I think you suggested that in some ways there is perhaps even a hopeful aspect to this embarrassing event, in that it suggests that the unquestioned control that the Israel lobby and the defense lobby, for example, and the other lobbies of the American 1% controlled over the, exercised over the American university, was in some sense breaking down. And the danger was that, you know, some of these dangerous thoughts would get out if something like this took place. The fact there's a dispute about that suggests not the strength of these lobbies, they're still quite strong, but perhaps some cracks in the facade?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's hard to imagine why they are so upset over something that if they just ignored would have gone forward and probably not made a whole lot of difference, although I really would have welcomed Stephen Salaita's perspectives on this campus, because going from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2 is a pretty big deal. There aren't any scholars in the liberal arts departments on this campus who are sort of directly engaged with the Palestine issue. And even he wouldn't have been in his teaching. He came here to teach literature in the context of Native American studies, but he has a history of commenting on Palestine, which is rare on this campus. But beyond that, it's just I wanted to say that it's so telling how everybody, it's perfect conventional wisdom for people to look back at the McCarthy era that Ron more or less referred to before with the blacklisting and so forth, and say, well, that was bad and everybody realizes it was wrong. And we can argue a little about who really was a communist and who wasn't, and Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs, but we realize that that was all really wrong and it went too far. But people can't relate, and people just assume, and people are human, and it's understandable if people have blind spots. But people just assume that if they were back there then, they'd see what was going on. We've learned something from that, and that bad stuff isn't going to happen again. And so here it is, it's happening again, And the people who enforce that sort of thing have all the same lame rhetoric that they had back then. Maybe it's a little different. Then it was about anti-communism and all this. Now it's about civility, but it's a pretty transparent cover for repressing certain points of view.
Yeah. Well, shouldn't in all consistency there be a committee of inquiry now to find out if any other faculty members have posted any tweets or said anything that in their private correspondence or even in their reading lists that they're assigning that might offend Zionist students?
Yeah, and they would argue, well, for people who already have tenure, it's different. But really, how is it different? If these people are so concerned about any student feeling uncomfortable in any class, then they've got a lot of work to do.
Yes.
There's a lot of people out there making students feel uncomfortable in various ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as I've mentioned before, there are those who might complain that fundamentalist Christian students are being upset and offended by the teaching of Darwinian evolution.
Well, we had a little brouhaha over over a Catholic teacher a couple of years ago, Carl, that I know you were somewhat involved in.
They had to bring in a ringer to teach his course.
Yeah, who was that person? I don't know.
Who was that masked man? Yeah. We have not talked about an important story tonight that we should talk about, and part of the reasons we've not talked about is because it's very unclear about what's happening. The U.S., as Ron mentioned earlier, has been much involved in Ukraine. The killing in Ukraine, which has been as substantial as the killing in Gaza, begins with the United States initiative. And for the moment, there seems to be a ceasefire in Ukraine, and peculiar forces are at work there, most of them covert, and most of them American. So paying attention to what's happening in Ukraine begins with understanding what American policy is over against the propaganda the U.S. offers, and that's not an easy task. Maybe we'll be able to spend some time on that next week.
But the relationship is so concrete when you think of the marriage between Robert Kagan and Victoria Nuland.
Which where we started today.
This is all starting in somebody's bed.
Possible symptom is that some say swastikas have started to appear openly on the streets of Kiev. They've spread from Lvov to Kiev, and it's an indication of what's happening.
German television station broadcast pictures of Ukrainian forces with swastikas and SS lightning bolts on their helmets last week, and that upset some people, as perhaps it should. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 38th week of 2014. Thanks to Jason Liggett for direction and production. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see our Facebook page for Aware for a link. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the rest, who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Zote, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.